resource management, strategic thinking, and dealing with unpredictable threats, be they nature, monsters, or other players. Survival games, of course, aren't realistic in the literal sense, but they're designed to feel real. The way they test players actually feels like something you might have to kind of go through to survive some kind of constant struggle with very high stakes. And an authentic experience in a survival game is bound to push you to your limits. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 20 survival games that truly test you. Let's get started with number 20, it's Stranded Deep. Let's start off with as traditional as a survival game as you're going to get. Stranded Deep puts you on a randomly generated tropical island with the basic goal of surviving and eventually finding a way out of there. You got a beautiful tropical environment and an unforgiving world where death waits around every corner, especially early on. Like many survival games, the hardest part is right at the start when you're still learning the ropes and figuring out how the game works. Once you build a proper raft, the experience gets a lot easier, but until then, the game pulls no punches. In terms of survival simulation, it's not the most in-depth or hardcore. You're not counting calories and painstakingly crafting every stick for a fire, but it's not exactly easy either. You do need to find clean water, and you can get food poisoning that'll dehydrate you super fast. Clean water is at a premium, so dying of thirst is fairly common for first-time players. Oh, what's this? A coconut? That should be safe to drink, right? Nope, you're going to have to do better than that here. Drinking water from a coconut's going to make you sick eventually, if not for the fact that it is a mild laxative, then purely for the awful taste. So here there's no relying on the usual survival game crutches. At number 19 is The Forest / Sons of the Forest. What starts off as your average survival game becomes something much more horrific. Once again, it's not the most realistic or in-depth survival experience. Just trying to stay alive in a hostile environment is actually the least of your concerns when you're stuck on an island inhabited by vicious cannibals and violent cave-dwelling mutants. So death rarely comes from starvation or sickness. You're mostly meeting your end from a serrated blade of a blood-soaked psycho, but there's still some challenging and realistic details in these games. Base construction is more hands-on than you usually get in a survival game. You actually have to cut down trees by hand. You cut those trees into logs and then boards, and all of a sudden it's a woodworking YouTube video. Building walls is not as simple as placing down a blueprint, and it's just auto-filling. You actually have to put the wood in place to build it out. If you want to make a tent, you just lay down a tarp and add a stick, instant tent. But that's more than you would have to do normally. Normally you would select the tent and the items and click where you want the tent. It makes crafting and building a satisfyingly tactile experience. In contrast to most other survival games though, all that stuff, it's just super abstract. Like I said, you pick an item and click. In other games, I'll also say maybe having to do everything by hand would be annoying, but here it works because the usual survival systems are a little more simplified. Doesn't mean it's not challenging though, just that the danger isn't primarily from nature. The real thing you have to worry about are the monsters who will beat down your door and drag you into some impossibly dark cave. And that's the thing about these games, sometimes they'll kill you fast, sometimes agonizingly slow. And number 18 is The Long Dark. Even though it's not technically complete, the story mode somehow still isn't actually finished yet. The Long Dark is a modern classic of the genre for good reason. While games like The Forest are more like monster mashes with survival elements, The Long Dark is about surviving the cold, harsh winter of northern Canada. There are dangers like wolves and bears stalking around. They're terrifying in their own right, don't get me wrong, but what you really have to worry about is the cold. Cold is the constant danger and the most consistent killer. Just being outside is dangerous in The Long Dark. How temperature works isn't exactly one-to-one with reality. It's gamified and abstracted, so you don't have to worry about your core temperature. And regardless of how cold it is outside, interiors are always the same temperature. Still, the game manages to do an admirable job of keeping the cold a constant concern. You have to dress up in multiple layers of clothing, all of which will eventually break down after extended use. They require repairs. yes, you're generally safe inside, but the more time spent indoors, the more stir-crazy you get with the literal cabin fever affliction. So you always have to be on the move, and even places where you're safe can start to feel dangerous after a while. The toughest thing about the game is there's no sustainability. Your only means of survival is through scavenging, and once you've picked a location dry, all you can really do is move on to the next place. Eventually, resources are just gonna run out. You won't be able to repair your clothes and get food sources. Everything just gets more scarce as time passes. In survival mode, you're eventually gonna die no matter what. It's a matter of how long you manage to keep going. And number 17 is Ancestors, the Humankind Odyssey. The game isn't difficult in the traditional sense. It's not a super hardcore simulation, but rather it's a more linear survival adventure. But the basic act of just playing the game is obscured. Almost nothing beyond the bare minimum is ever explained. And this isn't just some standard survival game, it's unlike almost everything else out there. That makes an extremely frustrating game for people who don't just look up what you're supposed to do. But if you stick with it, it's an interesting game buried in all the confusion. The game isn't about survival of a single individual, but the entire evolution of mankind from the earliest hominids to something resembling mankind today. It's very ambitious, it's very strange, and oh, is it frustrating and weird as hell. But that's why it's so intriguing. When the game starts, there's no user interface, and just learning to identify objects in the world is confusing. What's unusual for a game like this is you're not just relying on one sense, you have three: sight, hearing, and smell, and they're all mapped to different inputs. Evolving doesn't just come from gaining some generic experience, you have to do things to make it happen, and are often not explained at all. Like becoming a meat eater. At first, your monkey man is an herbivore. They get sick when they try to eat meat, but if you keep trying to eat meat, it'll eventually make it so your guy gets used to it, and your clan gets the meat eater trait when they evolve. That's a small example of the sort of things you have to do in the game. It's unlike anything else, so even basic actions like that can come off confusing when you're actually playing the game. It is an unforgiving experience that isn't quite like any other survival game out there, and it's worth a shot for somebody looking for something different. And number 16 is Green Hell. Now here's where things start to get really hardcore. Green Hell is it's a survival game set in the Amazon rainforest. It pulls no punches in survival simulation. Nothing is easy about this game. Your diet is complex. The various plants and animals all have special medicinal or dietary purposes. And eating is just one of the things you have to do to survive, and it's definitely not enough on its own. There's hostile creatures and natives, but the most dangerous thing out there is the environment itself. Walk through rivers and you get leeches on your limbs. Sleep on the ground, you get worms that tunnel under your skin. You have to remove them with a knife. Yikes. Getting food poisoning, super easy, and once you're sick or injured, it's very difficult to get healthy again. Just doing something simple like lighting a fire is difficult. You need sticks, an ignition tool, dry tinder. If it gets wet, then it's ruined. And most importantly, the stamina to actually use the tool. If you're too tired to rub a stick, then you're screwed. Once you eventually understand how the game's many systems work and what the various plants can and will do for you, it does get a lot easier, but even then you're still constantly on a knife's edge, carefully balancing your food sources. You will get sick, so you gotta worry about that. And oh yeah, the hostile creatures that want to ruin your day. Green Hell manages to effectively mix gameplay and more survival, hardcore type stuff to make one of the most challenging but still relatively accessible games in the entire survival genre. And number 15 is My Summer Car. Green Hell may be the quintessential survivor game. My Summer Car isn't. It's bizarre. And that on the surface doesn't sound like a survival game at all, but believe me, it is. You play as a Finnish teenager on a summer break who has one and only one goal: to build a car. You start off in a house, you have beer and snacks, so what's the problem? Well, the stuff in your kitchen is only going to last so long, and eventually you're going to need groceries, but there's one little problem. Your car isn't just a fixer-upper, it's a blank frame. That's it. That's what it is. To build the car, you have to attach literally every single possible piece of the car to the frame, piece by painstaking piece. Those parts need to be secured by bolts, which are all different sizes and require different spanners. Just building the car is a nightmare. It's incredibly realistic in the construction, but it's so precise you either have to be a mechanic in real life to figure it all out, or you have to look up what to do online. Even then, it's very tedious, and that's just the start of the game. You've got multiple meters you have to keep topped up to avoid instantaneous onset death, like hunger and thirst, but also dirtiness. To keep your character happy, you have to keep an ample supply of booze and food, which requires a trip to the local grocery store. You'd think that'd be simple, but in my summer car, your average Sunday drive is a life or death struggle. You got a long way to go and the car is barely holding together. You're in constant danger of ending up in a ditch, and dangerous drivers will happily smash your car into tiny bits and drive away like it's no big deal. Inexplicably, the world of My Summer Car is one of the most deadly and difficult survival games out there. It is possible to reach a point of sustainability, but good luck lasting that long. At number 14 is This War of Mine, an unusual survival game that's less about managing a single guy with complex web of needs and more about the survival of a group. At the start of any given time, you get a small selection of survivors in a shelter where you're all holed up. There's a war going on in your city, supplies are short, safety nets are all broken, so it's up to you to survive any way you can. That means sending out people to scavenge for food and supplies and managing the needs of each survivor. You're not just filling up their hunger and thirst meters either. You have to worry about things like morale and sickness as well. Members of your group will die from sickness or hunger or just from a bullet to the face after opening the wrong door while scavenging. It's a brutal world out there, and often it's just up to the roll of the dice whether someone lives or dies. It's all mostly abstracted and plays closer to a management game than a full-on survival, but the unrelenting difficulty and the focus on trying to stay alive during a violent civil war really puts you in the headspace of a survivor, even if the presentation and premise is far removed from what you normally see in the genre. At number 13 is DayZ, one of the granddaddies of the survival game genre. This game started out as an Arma 2 mod before becoming a standalone product in 2013, and it's still going strong today. This multiplayer game is mercilessly difficult. If the erratic zombies don't kill you, then other players absolutely will, and if you die, it's all over. You lose everything after death. Even if you try to stash things away in something like a tent, other players can still find it. The survival mechanics are just as merciless as anything else. The game thrives on realism in many large and small ways, and if you don't know just how detailed the game can get, you're gonna be surprised. I'll give you one example. You can find canned food all over the place, but if you don't actually have something to open it, you'll still starve. You don't just have to worry about water, food, and health. You also have blood levels to worry about. When injured, you lose blood, which is going to cause your vision to black out, and you'll eventually pass out if nothing is done to curb the blood loss. This would all be bad enough on your own, but you're competing with other players and not just for kills. A lot of the time, when you start the game for the first time, everywhere near you will be picked clean. You don't even have the chance to survive because other players have just so happen to be there first. Surviving an hour is an accomplishment in DayZ. It's very lethal from almost any direction, and it's easily one of the most unforgiving survival experiences of all time. It's also a hell of a lot of fun, honestly. At number 12 is Don't Starve. For a game that looks as cartoony as this, you'd think it'd be easygoing. Maybe a kid-friendly survival game introducing them to the genre. In some ways, it is. The interface is at least a lot more user-friendly and simple than a lot of other games in the genre. But the similarities to like a baby's first survival game, they don't go a lot further than that. This game puts pressure on you right from the jump. You're short on time and resources. There's rarely a moment where you feel safe, not for a while at least. It's called Don't Starve, so no surprise here. Getting food is an important part of the game. Getting food means exploring, which puts you in the path of deadly monsters and an even deadlier night, which is not something you want to be caught out in. The survival elements are straightforward, to be fair, but it's how they're implemented into the game that makes it so challenging. Of course, with all the right knowledge, the game is a lot easier, but that doesn't mean it makes it easy, just less lethal. At number 11 is Card Survival Tropical Island. Looks like your average deck builder game, which is a dime a dozen on Steam, but Card Survival is 100% a for-real survival game. The cards are just the presentation. It's simplistic visually, but the simulation here is actually excellent. It's a mechanically deep survival game with plenty going on behind the scenes. It's also the second game on the list where you can die from coconut water diarrhea, which These games really hate people drinking from coconuts, but I can't stop laughing at the word diarrhea.
Hey, Lois, diarrhea.
I'm 100% dropping my iced tea every time that comes up. The game may appear basic at first, giving you only a few things to do. It's a really complicated game. Multiple separate body systems are simulated. Resources often have multiple different applications. There's so many different ways things can play out depending on your starting scenario even, and your available perks. There's a lot going on here.
Including diarrhea.
And number 10 is Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead. This game makes up for its simplified visuals with an almost overwhelming amount of complexity and depth. It's another zombie apocalypse game, and in this game it gets even crazier with all kinds of giant monsters and Lovecraftian abominations. But even with all the weirdness going on, the central survival simulation is the real thing to be afraid of. Actually, that's not true. It's the zombies. They're the worst, but surviving isn't easy. Getting wounded in the Cataclysm is easy, but healing is not. It takes a long time to recover from any significant injury, and if you don't have any medical skills, you won't even be able to use a first aid kit yourself, which, kicking myself for not going to nursing school there. In most cases, especially early on before you get any survival kits, any small setback can lead to a slow, lingering death. The amount of details here is just absurd. The game keeps track of ammo and your clips separately, not something you see that often. Lava causes your skin to blister if you stand too close to it. Gunshots can penetrate cover if its armor-piercing value is higher than the defensive value of the cover. If you wear a deputy badge, which you can just find laying around, then killer robots will think you're an authority figure and leave you alone. Everything has some kind of use or serves some kind of function, and there is just tons of stuff in the Cataclysm. This is a game you're most likely going to die from the many external threats hunting you in the post-apocalyptic world, so it's not as pure as other survival games out there, but it's a unique and challenging experience that's full of surprises. At number 9 is Subsistence. Think something like Rust, but with a focus on PvE and co-op. That is Subsistence. There's no story, no real explanation for what's going on. You're just having to deal with a very slow, difficult process of building up a base in order to survive. Getting started is a hell of a grind. You need a ton of resources to build pretty much anything. Food goes bad fast if you don't refrigerate it somehow. Rain will leave you cold and wet. Heat can cause dehydration. It's all very in-depth. And it's a lot more focused on resource management and building over your character's specific health concerns. It's one of those games that's so dead set on being realistic, it ends up being kind of a pain in the ass. But that's kind of the entire genre, if we're being super honest. It just depends on what your personal limit for that kind of nonsense is. And Subsistence unfortunately crossed that line for a lot of people with the tedious grinding requirements to make any substantial progress. Many players barely make it past a day or two. If it's not the hostile animals or hunters, it's the lack of food or healing items. Even on the easiest settings, the game is dead set on killing you. If it's not the realistic survival mechanics out there, in fact, a lot of the stuff seems like it'd be easier to do in real life than it is in the game. But for experienced survivors looking for a challenge, there's some fun to be had here. And number 8 is Oxygen Not Included. Take some of the complex chemical simulations going on in Kerbal Space Program, throw them into a survival game, and make everything even more absurdly complicated, and you got Oxygen Not Included. Like Don't Starve, this game looks kid-friendly and approachable, but looks are deceiving here as well. This is actually one of the most in-depth physics and chemistry simulations in any game ever. Period. The central gimmick of the game is that oxygen is at a premium. The little colonists start off in a relatively safe pocket of this randomly generated asteroid with a little bit of O2 to keep them alive, but beyond that, you're on your own. As your little guys breathe in air, that O2 becomes deadly CO2. Machines that do anything at all generate heat, and because you're in a closed environment, that heat has to be transferred somewhere, or all your little guys are going to cook in their own juices. Gases spread realistically, so it's possible to have oxygen spread too thin to be usable. Certain gases you need for crafting or action, moving them around, changing their state, or just getting rid of them. It's all required depending on the circumstances. Oxygen Not Included. It's a game where you can safely say that having a degree in chemistry or physics actually does make it easier to understand the game. They do obviously take creative liberties here and there to simplify a few things, but in general, it's a very intelligent game that requires some knowledgeable or just really persistent gumption, I guess, to get too far. At number 7 is Project Zomboid. When the third line you see after starting a new game is, "This is how you died," then yeah, you're dealing with an unforgiving game. The idea behind Project Zomboid is to create the most realistic possible zombie apocalypse. It's not a power fantasy where you're mowing down zombies left and right. This game is close to what would actually happen if the world got taken over by the undead. Or at least probably. We obviously don't know. That's never happened. But if the first few minutes of the game are anything to go by, we'd probably stumble around outside for a few minutes, draw the attention of every zombie in a 3-mile radius, and then die unceremoniously. That's generally how your first few runs of this game go. The start of the game is once again the hardest part. Just surviving the early days of the apocalypse is extremely difficult because any small cuts or sprains can spiral out into long-term injuries if they're not treated. Your character's mental state is just as important as their physical condition. It's easy to fall into depression if needs are not properly met. Your little guy can get stressed, can get addicted to cigarettes and alcohol, comfort foods, make your little guy happier and relieve boredom, sure. And boredom is another negative effect. There's just a lot to keep track of. Just one scratch or bite from a zombie gets you infected too, which is fatal. It makes any kind of supply run terrifying because one wrong move, one missed corner, you'll die. It's a very unforgiving game at times. It can feel almost random whether you live or die, but that's the goal of the game. Life isn't fair. Sometimes you'll be able to build a self-sufficient base that's all but impenetrable. Sometimes you cut your hand on some glass. You'll get an infection and then you'll die from it. That's Project Zomboid. Unforgiving as it is sometimes random, but it's always compelling. At number 6 is Neo Scavenger. This turn-based survival roguelike is unique. Most survival games have little or no story, while this game actually does. You play as a specific character with directly stated goals. It's a much more story-based experience than you normally get in one of these games, but the survival elements are still about as hardcore as they get. There are a lot of status bars to keep track of on top of the usual food and water stuff. You gotta stay rested, comfortable, you got a blood pain level to maintain, then there's your immune system along with pain tolerance. All these various bars affect your character's overall performance, and the lower they get, the more you suffer from various penalties to movement, defense, sleep quality, all kinds of stuff. First aid and recovery is complicated as hell too. You're not just bandaging wounds, you have to sterilize them first and use sprints when your limbs are damaged. Don't use dirty rags though, because you'll get an infection. We love infections, don't we? Clean rags eventually do become dirty rags, might I add, so you have to swap them out after a while, and to recover you're going to have to rest for long periods of time. You heal faster than in real life, but for a game, it's a painfully slow process. It's a brutally difficult game all around, and there's an actual story propelling you forward, set in a crazy post-apocalypse where anything goes. It's like Fallout with the most punishing survival mod you can think of. At number 5, it's Stationeers, a space-based survival game at its most unforgiving, and I'm not exaggerating by saying without a coding or engineering background, this is going to be a tough game. How everything works in Stationeers is extremely in-depth. There's very little in the way of abstraction, so even basic systems like electrical wiring and oxygen management, they're tough. It's a game with automation that at some point you're going to need to get running, but to do so you literally have to code using an in-game panel. They barely do anything to make the process simpler. If you're unable to do that, at least fans have made programs that you can find online, so you can just use that. But it's still really crazy hardcore. There's nothing intuitive about this game at all. Things just won't work for you, and you won't know why because of how intricate the simulation is. It's one of those games where you have to watch multiple extensive tutorials just to understand the basics. So for people who really want to get into the nitty-gritty of space survival, there is an extremely interesting and challenging game here, but it's not for the faint of heart. And number 4 is Unreal World. This one goes all the way back to 1992. It's one of the genre's first real titles, and it's still getting updated today. Seriously, the last update at time of writing was September 13th, last week. They didn't actually add most of the features of the game, particularly the ones it's actually known for, until around 1996, but still, this has got a hell of a legacy. As far as survival gameplay goes, this one's very traditional but extremely difficult. The graphics look like they're from 1992, the UI is confusing, kind of hard to tell what you're even looking at sometimes, but the survival gameplay is some of the best and most realistic out there. The game just drops you into a forest in a slightly fantastical Finland and tells you to survive if you can. Most of the time, you can't. Surviving the first winter is no joke. The game simulates the effects of frostbite on separate body parts. You have to stockpile preservable supplies because there's fewer animals to hunt. Just being outside affects your health, and walking through all the tall snow wears you out. Basically, winter sucks. Your actual goals here are quite simple compared to other survival games. Build a stable homestead, go hunting, trapping, and fishing, and trade with nearby villagers. But the complexity of the mechanics make even these simple goals quite difficult. Hunting and trapping in this game, they're far more difficult than in almost any other survival game, but if you do manage to bring down a buck, which is unlikely without a lot of skill in archery, you'll be set for a long time because you can actually get a realistic amount of meat from it. The meat can, of course, go bad. There's no real refrigeration, so the best you can do is build a proper cellar where food keeps at least a little better than being left out in the wild. It's not a game where you're programming complex logic gates and managing electrical wattage with step-up, step-down generators or anything like that. It's all a lot more primitive, so the complexity comes from how realistic the basic survival systems are. Building anything in real life is difficult and time-consuming. Hunting is tricky. Surviving the winter when you're just one guy alone in a shack in the woods, it's not easy. In fact, it's super hard. And number 3 is Rust. As a survival game, Rust isn't all that realistic, at least when it comes to the actual mechanics. But the PvP, man, it is unbelievable how punishing it can be. There are people who go so far that they're literally sleeping at their desks to defend their bases. Rust is your average survivor game, but with a PvP twist. Everyone starts out with nothing, has to scratch and claw their way to some kind of safety, getting to a point where you can feel even remotely secure in your own base. This takes a long time. And even then, it becomes an almost full-time job making sure your stuff remains secure. I'm not exaggerating. It's a common story that in Rust, people have stayed awake for far too long just to make sure that nobody's breaking into their base. It's because of how unforgiving the standard PvP can be, and just how toxic other players are in general. There are peaceful servers where players are just screwing around and having fun, but if you're into the PvP, you got to prepare to play the game for a long time, or just accept that your base is going to be broken into at some point. The brutal thing is that your character remains in the game at all times. When you log off, your dude just goes to sleep where you quit. The game has permadeath, and everything you've got exists somewhere in the game world, so if someone has the proper tools, and no matter how tough your doors are or how many layers of defenses you have, they can eventually be breached. If you're not there to keep an eye on things, you're just an easy target. And number 2 is SCUM, another PvP survival game, only this time the survival elements are cranked up beyond all reason. SCUM is a game where if you eat too much candy, it'll rot your teeth. If you fire a gun inside, your ears are going to ring. You can protect yourself by wearing earmuffs, though. If you get wet, you actually get physically heavier until you dry off. It's a whole game of little details like that. It also has the most complicated nutrition system in any survival game I've ever seen. You've got calories, water, muscle, and fat. Not that impressive, right? But there's also vitamins and minerals, and that's not just 1 meter. The game keeps track of 23 separate meters for this stuff. They also keep track of digestion and separate it into stomach, intestine, colon, and bladder. And don't forget the macronutrient reserves. Can't forget those. Doesn't even stop there. The game keeps track of nutrient absorption speed and body mass distribution. I don't think nutrition in real life is this complicated. I'm pretty sure there's no way to accurately measure stuff like half the things going on here, but if you're playing this game, you better pay attention. Actually, most of the stuff barely matters, but the complexity is still impressive in its own bizarre way. And finally, at number 1, it's Vintage Story. It looks like Minecraft, but when it comes to brutally difficult and surprisingly realistic survival games, Vintage Story is next level. It's not so complex with the survival stuff like nutrients and food, but the crafting and gathering part of the game it's on a level beyond anything else. Crafting isn't done by building a bench and using a few pieces of wood. No! You have to first make a napping surface out of loose stone, and then you form the object you want to make out of the grid. Making something out of clay, it's even more complicated. You got to form the shape first, similar to napping, but then you have to place the shape in a pit kiln, which needs dry grass, sticks, and firewood. It's going to take a little longer than a few seconds for that pottery to harden, too. It takes like 20 in-game hours for a pot to finish. Smithing is even more complicated. Now you have to actually shape a heated up ingot, which is its own complicated process to create. While in hammer mode, there are multiple different types of hammer hits, different directions. It's extremely in-depth. Doing almost anything in Vintage Story, it's time-consuming, difficult, and it tends to require about 3 more resources than you probably used in other crafting games. It's a game that requires patience and diligence to get anywhere. It's not unusually punishing or anything to play like, most of these games. There aren't a million ways to die out of nowhere, but it requires so much work to do even the most basic things. This one is only for the most dedicated survivalists out there. It's unforgiving and challenging not because it's so brutal, but because it's almost as slow, tedious, and exhausting as real life. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.